Imagine a dusty stone cellar in the French countryside. A farmer is there, tending to wheels of cheese exactly as his grandfather did before him. It's a scene of perfect rustic tradition. But then the mood shifts entirely. A man walks in, not a customer, and certainly not a local. He's wearing a crisp, tailored suit and holding a digital tablet. He doesn't look at the cheese, he looks at the humidity sensors. He measures the distance between the shelves with a laser. He speaks with a calm, almost clinical detachment. He politely informs the farmer that a centuries-old method is now illegal, not because anyone got sick, and not because the customers complained. It's illegal simply because a committee sitting in a glass office block 500 miles away decided the moisture content was 1% too high for the new standard. This suit-wearing stranger wasn't an invader in the traditional sense. He didn't carry a gun or plant a flag. But as he handed over the compliance order that would likely bankrupt the farm, I realized I was watching a modern form of warfare. It wasn't a battle over territory, but a quiet bureaucratic conquest.
The farmer was losing his livelihood not to an army, but to a directive he never voted for, written by people he will never meet. It made me wonder, if you can't fire the people destroying your way of life, is it really your country anymore? That opening story, it really sets a powerful, almost uncomfortable metaphor for modern governance.
It really does. It's this idea of a conquest that isn't achieved with armies, but with paperwork and compliance checks.
Right. The conflict isn't violent, it's administrative. And that's what we're diving into today.
Exactly. It strikes right at the heart of economic vitality and, democratic accountability. The material we've pulled together for this deep dive is all focused on that.
Specifically on the political and economic models, mostly in the European Union, that critics are arguing lead directly to this state of what they call technocratic feudalism.
That's the term, yeah.
So our mission today is, well, it's complex. We need to investigate how these regulatory frameworks, these seemingly unaccountable power structures impact everything.
From that one small French business all the way up to the fundamental definitions of what national sovereignty even means anymore.
Oh, and crucially, we have to connect this whole dynamic in Europe to what we're seeing evolve really quickly in the United States.
We're absolutely looking for those patterns. We're asking whether this fusion of big tech and big government in the U.S. is basically creating a digital version of the exact same unaccountable elite control structure.
So we'll be exploring the political democratic deficit. We'll analyze the whole battle over sovereignty.
And then we'll assess the geopolitical implications of choosing this kind of supranational governance model. What does it mean for the world?
Okay, let's unpack this new reality, starting with the term itself, technocratic feudalism. It's a phrase that it really packs a punch. It sounds medieval, but at the same time, hyper-modern.
It does. It's a heavy-duty criticism, and it's leveled at these highly centralized systems where the ultimate power doesn't reside in, a traditional aristocracy.
But in a small group of unelected experts, managers, or, I guess today, maybe even algorithms and data lords.
Precisely. And the term itself draws this direct, and I think really chilling, parallel back to the Cold War era.
Okay, tell me more about that. What's the historical context here?
We can actually trace the grounding of this concept back to a dissident writer, Valentin Mraz, who was critiquing Soviet communism decades ago.
Okay.
He argued that the Soviet system had, in effect, replaced the old, land-based feudalism with a technocratic feudalism.
And what did he mean by that?
In his view, a small elite core dictated policy to spiritually starved and just economically exploited the rest of the population.
That is a powerful framework. So the core idea is that the mechanism of control, it shifts.
It shifts completely.
It's no longer about controlling land or wealth in the traditional sense or armies. It's about controlling access, standards, and the whole apparatus of state regulation and data.
Exactly. Mraz's critique is so sharp because it highlights that control by bureaucracy and technical expertise, that's the techno part, can be just as oppressive and just as unaccountable as control by lineage, which is the feudalism part.
And in the modern EU context, the criticism is that the institution is increasingly, and I'm quoting here, strangled by EU bureaucracy, hyper-regulation, and an ideological green agenda.
Strangled is the key word.
And when you say strangled, you mean it's sacrificing core economic competitiveness, small-scale vitality?
Yeah.
All for centralized political control and a kind of ideological uniformity.
Precisely that. Critics argue the system just becomes a barrier to prosperity. It's a machine that's designed to enforce uniformity, and that machine is inherently slow, it's distant, and it's rigid.
Which makes it impossible for dynamic, localized economies to really thrive.
They just can't.
And this is where that French cheese farmer analogy becomes so compelling. It's not just a cute story. It's a perfect illustration of what you're calling regulatory conquest.
It's the perfect microcosm of the whole thing. You have a centuries-old, locally perfected method of creating this artisanal product.
Right. Tradition, expertise, an actual economic engine for that community.
And it gets wiped out, not because of market forces, not because of a failure of quality, but by a numerical dictate.
From an unseen committee sitting in a glass office block 500 miles away.
A committee that decided a parameter, like moisture content, was 1% too high for some new continent-wide standard.
So the farmer loses his livelihood because his cheese is traditional, not because it's bad. He's being forced to comply with a generalized rule that was probably designed for mass industrial production.
Not for artisanal survival. It really highlights the fundamental conflict here.
Which is?
The deep localized knowledge that's embedded in those traditional methods is just deemed subservient to these generalized uniform directives. And they're written by people who, likely have zero practical experience in that specific field.
That's the conquest. The regulatory framework itself becomes the weapon.
It becomes the tool of the elite to define reality for everyone else.
And the real issue of conquest isn't even the rule itself. I mean, a food safety rule could be a good thing. It's the massive accountability gap behind the person writing that rule.
That's it.
The farmer has no mechanism to appeal, and more importantly, no way to fire the person who wrote the rule.
And that leads us directly into the political framework of the EU and its alleged democratic deficit. This accountability gap is absolutely fundamental, and it starts with how power moves within the system.
Okay, walk us through that process. How does power physically move away from the citizen's reach?
Well, we talk about two types of power movement. First, there's what's called the vertical transfer of functions.
Okay, vertical transfer.
Functions that used to be held by the nation state, by, say, Paris or Berlin, are transferred up vertically to a transnational governance system, like the EU in Brussels.
Right.
The problem is these new supranational institutions were often not originally designed with robust democratic accountability or control mechanisms in mind.
Yeah.
Their purpose was different.
It's almost like a company where the local branch manager used to make all the decisions about staffing and product quality, but now all those decisions have been moved up to a central headquarters.
In another country.
Right, in another country. And that headquarters only focuses on, like, macro strategy, not the local reality.
That's a very helpful analogy. And that vertical transfer has a critical secondary effect. It triggers a horizontal transfer of power, but at the national level.
Okay, how does that work?
Because the core decisions are now being made at the EU level, they end up being handled by the national executive, the prime minister or the foreign minister, who deals with international policy.
Ah, I see. So domestic policy is normally handled by the national parliament, the representative assembly, where elections and debate matter most.
Correct.
But when those same policies get relabeled as European affairs, they shift over to the executive branch, which is inherently less transparent and less accountable to the public on a day-to-day basis.
Precisely. So power shifts horizontally from the sphere of the representative parliamentary assembly, which is supposed to be accountable, toward the historically less accountable pillar of foreign affairs and executive international negotiation.
And the national parliaments are just left scrambling to
What?
retroactively oversee decisions that have already been agreed upon in Brussels.
That's often the case, yes. They're playing catch-up.
The heart of this institutional design, it seems, is the European Commission itself. How does its structure contribute to this perception of unaccountability?
The Commission is the motor of the entire system. It explicitly sees itself as the policymaker and engine of the European Union.
Its job is to propose legislation and just drive political integration forward.
That is its function. However, its whole organizational ethos, as noted by critics, is neither geared to audit nor to managerialism. It's not set up to worry about rigorous internal control or transparency.
It's set up to push.
It's set up to push.
That sounds like a body designed for political action, not for careful administration.
It is.
And that inherent political pushiness, I assume, leads us straight into this political science thicket known as comitology.
Yes.
This term sounds incredibly abstract, but from what I've read, it represents a massive, and some would say undemocratic power grab.
It's critically important to understand comitology. It's the process by which the council, which represents the member state governments, often results to just passing outline legislation.
So broad skeletal laws.
Very broad. And then they rely almost entirely on the commission to fill in all the technical details, using its implementation powers, which were granted under what was Tech Article 211 and are now enshrined in the Lisbon Treaty.
So the elected political body says, here's the general idea, and the unelected bureaucracy says, don't worry, we'll write the thousands of pages of rules to make that idea work.
Exactly. And the core democratic challenge lies in the oversight mechanism for those thousands of pages of rules.
Which is what?
These regulations made by the Commission are subject only to the advisory opinions of a whole network of specialized committees.
Okay, but who are these committees?
And here's the crucial part. These committees are appointed by and are responsible to the Commission itself.
Wait, so it's an internal feedback loop?
Completely.
The Commission writes the rules, appoints the committee to advise it on the rules, and then it implements the rules. Where is the citizen's voice in any part of that process?
It is virtually non-existent, which is why comitology is so intensely criticized for its impenetrability. It's a black box.
Impenetrable.
It's extremely difficult for outsiders, journalists, civil society, even national parliaments, to track or understand how a specific directive, say, one affecting the moisture content of cheese, actually materialized.
Politically, then, it's seen as usurping the European Parliament's rightful place in the legislative process.
And critically, it's seen as virtually escaping effective parliamentary control entirely.
So even though the European Parliament, the EP, has slowly gained more legislative functions over the years, comitology is like the administrative loophole where the technocrats can just run rings around the elected officials.
That is the fundamental tension. While the EP has been strengthened in its legislative, budgetary, and control functions, this massive body of implementation law remains largely outside its direct reach.
It ensures that the bureaucratic engine just keeps running, regardless of the slow pace of elected democracy.
It does.
But the sources we've looked at show that national parliaments haven't completely acquiesced to this erosion of power. They have fought back.
Oh, absolutely. When you have these moments of profound institutional change, national systems often reassert themselves. A great example is what happened in France during the ratification of the Maastricht Treaty.
Okay.
The necessity of holding a national referendum on such a major cession of sovereignty was leveraged by the French National Assembly to dramatically expand its own internal powers concerning European affairs.
That's fascinating. So the executive branch traditionally handled all international negotiations, but the legislature basically said, hey, if we have to vote on this, we are claiming a stake in the process.
It was a decisive break from that tradition of executive-only international negotiations. The Assembly essentially forced itself into the oversight process for European decisions.
We saw something similar in Germany, right, with their constitutional court.
Yes, Germany's constitutional court, the German Federal Constitutional Court, issued a very prominent and stern judgment.
What was the essence of that German warning?
The court warned the government that the cession of powers to the EU would only be tolerated up to a certain point.
A line in the sand.
A constitutional line in the sand. They said that any excessive transfer of power might be deemed unconstitutional under German basic law. It was a clear message.
A message to their own government saying the constitutionally mandated sovereignty of the German people, which is vested in its parliament, cannot be endlessly diluted by this process of European integration.
Precisely.
So these national acts of resistance, they show that democratic reflexes, while maybe slow, are still active.
They are.
Yet even with these efforts to strengthen national oversight in the European Parliament, the Council, which again represents the executives of the member states, seem to retain a trump card to limit accountability.
They do. Even with the strengthening of the EP's role through what's called the ordinary legislative procedure, the Council retains the power to revert to old procedures when they're adopting new treaty articles. Meaning the Council, which is essentially the group of government executives, can strategically avoid the full weight of parliamentary scrutiny. It undercuts the EP's legislative accountability and lets member states maintain flexibility and control way it suits them.
The system seems designed to maintain this inherent tension, which keeps the whole concept of sovereignty constantly in play. If power is constantly being shifted up, down, and sideways, What does sovereignty even mean anymore in the European context?
Sovereignty has become the single most contested signifier in European politics. That's really the heart of it.
It's the core debate.
It is. The debate is fundamentally structured around this axis of integration versus protecting national competencies. And sovereignty is used as a kind of political currency.
Filled with whatever meaning a political actor wants to justify their specific vision of the EU's future.
Exactly, creating a cleavage we call the sovereignty dimension between communitarianism and cosmopolitanism.
Okay, so let's break down how this currency is defined. Let's start with the most restrictive and maybe the simplest model, exclusively national sovereignty.
This model adheres strictly to the traditional view. It says the nation-state is the sole possessor of supreme political authority.
The classic definition.
Yeah.
People, territory, borders.
The Weberian definition, yes. Proponents, who are typically on the right and conservative side of the spectrum parties, like France's Rassemblement National, the RN, or Les Republicans, LR, they demand the repatriation of competencies.
They want to bring power back to the nation-state.
Bring it back. They see sovereignty as a zero-sum game. If you share it, you lose it. They want to target the European Commission, especially in non-economic areas where they feel centralization has gone way too far.
For them, integration has to be severely limited or reversible or just outright rejected in core areas of identity and law. It's a defense of the traditional national structure.
It is. Now, you can compare that to the second model, which is often favored by governments that are currently in power, pooled sovereignty.
This sounds like the compromise position, the pragmatic view.
It is the pragmatic solution. It accepts the idea of sharing authority, but it restricts the extent and the area of that sharing to very specific, profitable, or necessary policy domains.
So things like defense or a coordinated migration policy or the economic monetary union.
Exactly. Integrate only where the cost of going it alone is higher than the cost of losing some national autonomy.
It's a cost-benefit analysis of sovereignty.
It is, and that's why governments like the German ruling coalition involving the CDU, CSU, and SPD find this model so invaluable. It lets them argue for necessary integration because, global challenges are too big for one nation.
While at the same time claiming national sovereignty is protected because the pooling is restricted and it's conditional. They can have it both ways.
They can argue for a Europe that people run into out of, quote, hope, conviction, and self-interest.
And the sources mention that Germany really stressed subsidiarity as the key to this.
Yes, the principle that decisions should be made at the lowest practical level.
But even in an area like defense, where pooling seems kind of obvious and necessary, there's still conflict.
There is. German decision makers, for example, have been pretty ambivalent about a fully fledged European defense union. It reflects this deep tension over Germany's global military role.
With some smaller parties just opposing it altogether, saying it's leading to a Europe of war and armaments.
So even within that pooled model, the boundaries are constantly being negotiated and fought over.
Okay, and that brings us to the third and most ambitious view, nested or European sovereignty.
Right, this is the full Euro enthusiast view. It's often promoted by French centrist parties like La République En Marche.
And the idea here is that national and European sovereignty are not in conflict at all.
Not at all. In this view, they are complementary. They support and strengthen each other. So national sovereignty is nested inside a larger, more powerful European framework.
And this model is aiming for a truly sovereign EU with serious global projection capacity.
Yes, it's tied to that idea of strategic autonomy, the capacity for the EU to really weigh in on international issues as a major geopolitical actor and, disseminate its model and its values globally.
But the critics immediately push back on this.
Immediately. They argue that this definition of European sovereignty is often really blurred and contested. They say it's built on a non-existent European citizenry, and it's protecting European interests that haven't even been clearly defined by the people.
It's fascinating how quickly political actors will shift between these different models based on what they want to achieve in the moment.
The pragmatic, instrumental use of sovereignty is a key political strategy, and we saw this so visibly in Poland under the former ruling party, ZP. They were incredibly strategic about it.
How so?
On one hand, they would criticize EU involvement in migration as a threat to national sovereignty.
A straight adoption of the exclusively national model.
Exactly. But then, on the other hand, they would demand more EU involvement in security and in the internal market, and they would justify that using the pooled model.
So they simultaneously position themselves as fierce protectors of national sovereignty, against Brussels' interference in social policy.
While at the same time demanding Brussels money and centralized power for economic gain or for security, it was a kind of political jujitsu. It shows that sovereignty, in their eyes, is not some fixed constitutional principle. It's a political currency.
It used to maximize domestic political support while still leveraging all the benefits of integration.
And the result is this incredibly dynamic political landscape where the very definition of power is constantly up for grabs.
We've looked pretty extensively at the bureaucratic conquest and the accountability gap in the EU and defined this technocratic feudalism as a system of, paper and regulatory control.
Yeah.
But let's shift gears now.
Okay.
Because many commentators are using this exact same framework to describe dynamics that are emerging in the United States. And here, the conquest isn't paper, it's digital.
That's the critical parallel. The U.S. criticism is centered on the emergence of a digital Leviathan. And this is seen as resulting from an unprecedented fusion of big tech and big government.
So control is exercised not through Brussels directives, but through this centralized infrastructure of surveillance that's built by private companies, but wielded by state power.
That's the model. And this infrastructure is already deeply embedded, starting with firms like Palantir Technologies. The sources describe Palantir as the linchpin of federal data analytics.
Palantir is the operational core of this digital control.
It is. It's a data mining firm that, it grew out of early seed money from intelligence agencies, and it has secured massive federal contracts, including a staggering $795 million deal with the Pentagon.
And the technology's goal is to do what, exactly?
Its goal is to potentially merge information from different agencies, to fuse databases of biometric IDs, tracking records, behavioral data
into a single, unified, all-seeing system. The scale of that is genuinely frightening. It sounds like a single database of nearly every American's life and interactions.
It does. What's the ultimate fear about how a system like this could be applied domestically?
The fear is that the system moves beyond tracking foreign adversaries and becomes an instrument of deliberate control. Critics are warning this infrastructure could be used to police immigrants, illegals, and punish critics.
So it moves from targeting specific external threats to managing and controlling domestic dissent or specific populations through algorithmic enforcement.
That's the deep concern.
And if Palantir is the analytical backbone of this system, then Amazon Ring seems to be the eyes on the street, kind of normalizing the surveillance apparatus among ordinary citizens.
Exactly right. Amazon's Ring doorbell division has successfully brokered video sharing partnerships with over 1,400 police agencies all across the country.
Which creates a new pervasive neighborhood watch, but one where the police effectively have access to millions of private camera feeds.
It's the voluntary surrender of privacy. People install these cameras for their own security, and the police can then request the footage for specific events, often with just a quick email request rather than a traditional warrant based on probable cause.
It normalizes an eyes everywhere system. I mean, civil liberties experts argue that if the police outright demanded every citizen install a camera and provide access, people would understandably revolt.
Of course they would. But Amazon's clever market workaround achieves the same outcome while making the citizen feel safe and, complicit.
And this footage, once it's collected, can be stored indefinitely and then potentially shared with federal agencies like the Department of Homeland Security or the FBI.
The chain of data just grows longer and longer.
And then you have Google, the data titan, which brings its own set of tools to this digital Leviathan through mechanisms like geofence warrants.
Google has amassed these unparalleled troves of granular location data on almost everyone. Law enforcement leverages this by routinely compelling Google, via these geofence warrants, to hand over anonymized location records.
Records of any devices that happen to be in a specific area at a specific time.
Any and all of them.
So if a crime happens on a specific street corner at 3 p.m., law enforcement can ask Google for a list of every single phone that was there, effectively creating a list of witnesses and potential suspects, regardless of their connection to the crime.
It is a digital dragnet. Privacy advocates point out that this inevitably captures dozens, maybe hundreds of innocent bystanders who are only unmasked later after the pool of suspects is narrowed down.
It completely reverses the traditional investigative process. Instead of starting with a suspect, you start with a massive net and just reel everyone in.
It's a tremendous power to put in the hands of the state, and it's mediated entirely by a private, profit-driven corporation.
The synthesis here seems clear. Big tech is not just complying with the state, it's becoming the de facto technocratic enforcement arm.
It's managing the logistics of surveillance and control that the government couldn't possibly manage on its own. And you can add Clearview AR to that list.
Right, the facial recognition company.
They scraped billions of images from social media to create the world's largest facial recognition database. This system can match a photo from a street protest to a person's online identity within seconds.
And it spread rapidly across hundreds of police agencies, way outpacing any legal safeguards or public debate.
It is the epitome of the digital technocratic control we're discussing.
This whole development, where the fruits of innovation are used to create systems of mass surveillance and algorithmic control, it seems to stand in such stark contrast to the original civic-minded ideals of science and technology in the U.S.
It really does.
What happened to the ethical foundation of STEM?
The foundational vision of STEM science, technology, engineering, and mathematics in the United States was, it was rooted in Enlightenment ideals. The goal was to diffuse power, not concentrate it.
To create citizen scientists.
Exactly. The idea was that people needed to be scientifically literate to be functional citizens in a democracy. It was about expanding human autonomy and critical thinking.
Not just training highly specialized technical workers,
right,
but creating citizens who were equipped to understand and solve society's grand challenges.
And the idea that today's most advanced STEM efforts are culminating in these surveillance systems that reduce individuals to data points. A digital prison, as one constitutional lawyer put it, is a profound betrayal of that heritage.
The whole purpose of innovation was to expand liberty, not shrink it.
That was the ideal.
What I find genuinely encouraging, though, is that the conscience of the technologists themselves has begun to push back against this digital Leviathan.
That's where the ethical crisis becomes visible and, frankly, where there's some hope. The uproar over Project Maven at Google is a landmark example.
You mind us what that was?
Google partnered with the Pentagon to use AI to analyze drone surveillance footage. It was essentially to streamline the process for lethal drone strikes. When the partnership became public, the internal protest was immediate and intense.
And what was the scale of that resistance?
Nearly 4,000 Google employees signed a petition in protest, and about a dozen resigned outright over it.
What?
They were demanding very clearly a choice in what we build and a say in how it is used. They just were not willing to stand silently while their expertise was being weaponized for mass lethal means or surveillance.
That resistance really demonstrates that professionals in STEM are not just passive cogs in the corporate machine.
Not at all. They are actively opposing the use of their research for purposes they deem morally compromising.
And their actions forced a global reckoning on this.
It did. It demands that technological expertise be matched by robust ethical judgment. If that moral guidance is absent, brilliant engineers and scientists risk becoming the unwitting enablers of the digital Leviathan simply because they lack the ability to navigate how their inventions are ultimately used by these powerful institutions.
This comparison of the EU's bureaucratic centralization and the US's digital convergence, it raises these profound questions about the viability of the whole supranational governance model itself in a global context.
Oh, it does.
If the EU is a laboratory for deep integration, what does the rest of the world think of the results of the experiment?
The EU model, with its systemic complexity and its perceived accountability deficits, is increasingly being assessed as a cautionary tale by major global powers. The sources we looked at highlight a really significant geopolitical shift.
Tell us about that shift.
According to a December 2025 assessment, the United States, under its current strategy, is explicitly rejecting the liberal dream of global governance. It's rejecting the kind of supranational bureaucracies the EU has built.
Why?
Because these complex structures are now seen by critics as engines of dysfunction.
That is a fundamental reversal of decades of globalist philosophy. It signals a pivot toward a system where national identity, boundaries, and national autonomy are paramount again.
A rejection of the EU's institutional model. The new geopolitical posture recognizes a world where, and I'm quoting the assessment here, nations are back, identity matters, borders matter, sovereignty matters.
So this perception frames the EU's supranational governance with its opaque, complex decision-making as an example of how the erosion of national autonomy undermines political vitality and just leads to sclerosis.
Yes, if the EU model is viewed as promoting political paralysis and some would say cultural disintegration by prioritizing bureaucracy and ideology over dynamic national interests.
Then the U.S. rejection of that model is truly a geopolitical earthquake.
It implies a belief that true stability and strength are built on sovereignty and self-determination, not on layers of unaccountable transnational regulatory bodies.
And this skepticism is compounded by the EU's persistent administrative and financial difficulties. Another key lesson in why complexity can lead to a lack of control.
Absolutely.
And nothing illustrates the systemic complexity and the lack of financial control more vividly than that high-profile crisis that led to the resignation of the entire European Commission in the late 1990s.
That was a defining moment, the collegial resignation of the Santer Commission in 1999. It followed an investigation into severe allegations of fraud and mismanagement.
And the Commission's slow and, well, inadequate response to those allegations forced the European Parliament to establish a committee of independent experts.
It did. And that crisis, while it was damaging, it inadvertently raised the profile and the power of the EP's budgetary control functions in a major way.
So the systemic failure ultimately led to some institutional strengthening, but did it actually fix the underlying problem of auditability? Can they audit the system?
That's the persistent challenge. Achieving financial probity is extremely difficult because of the very structure of the EU. The Commission itself doesn't directly deliver the services or programs on the ground.
Right. Its two largest programs, the Common Agricultural Funding and the Structural Funding, are administered by national and subnational administrations across all 27 member states.
Which means the money flows from Brussels, through national governments, down to regional authorities, and finally to the end recipient.
Creating what's known as an exceptionally complex audit chain.
It is. And the European Court of Auditors, the ECA, is required to audit these vast, complex, cross-border transactions, often dealing with 27 different national audit techniques and rules.
It sounds impossible. How do they cope with the volume?
They're forced to rely on spot sampling. They examine approximately 600 transactions annually.
Wait, 600 transactions out of how many total?
Out of roughly 360,000 transactions annually.
That can't be right.
It is. And accountancy experts have noted that this sampling base of 600 is statistically far too small for any kind of reliable extrapolation about the overall financial health and propriety of the entire system.
To put that in perspective for you, that's like trying to audit the finances of a massive multinational corporation by only looking at 2 receipts.
It's a tiny, tiny fraction. The sheer scale and the structural separation between the centralized source of the funds and the decentralized execution by member states make traditional effective accountability almost impossible.
And we circle right back to the core ethos of the Commission we talked about earlier.
Its focus is on being the engine of integration and policymaking. It is not set up to prioritize audit or managerialism.
Which makes internal financial control inherently weak and transparency a perennial cause for complaint.
And as the EU boundaries widen and those audit chains get even longer through continuous enlargement, these structural accountability issues only become more and more severe.
This entire investigation, it really reveals a fundamental shared challenge that spans continents and political systems. Whether we look at the EU's regulatory machine or the US's digital convergence, the risk is ultimately the same.
It is. Systems that are designed for efficiency and for transnational coordination can, and often do, become instruments of unaccountable power.
The modern form of this technocratic feudalism replaces traditional forms of control with a dominance that's built on algorithms, on big data, and on opaque bureaucratic directives.
In Europe, the individual is threatened by the paper conquest of centralized regulation. In the U.S., the individual is threatened by the Digital Leviathan of fused corporate and governmental surveillance.
The ultimate synthesis here is that the integrity of governance and the freedom of citizens, it depends on maintaining a constant vigilant balance. We have to ensure that the pursuit of efficiency and security doesn't compromise fundamental liberty.
And that power remains diffused, serving the people it is meant to represent, not merely the elite few who staff the central office blocks or control the data streams.
The path forward has to be guided by wisdom, insisting that technology and regulation reflect the civic values of autonomy and accountability.
It's about ensuring the political integrity of the nation remains sovereign over the demands of the technocrat. The critical takeaway from all this is that the forces driving this centralization and unaccountability are structural. They demand not just political resistance, but a fundamental ethical reckoning with the tools we have created. Because the conquest is quiet and the stakes are our sovereignty.